Hey everyone, welcome to Current Events by Theater Equity Revolution. I'm Ana Sofia Villanueva, and I'm a theater arts producer, director, writer, and equity specialist. My work is often centered on expanding access to who gets to make theater, with an emphasis on queer and/or Latinx communities, as well as youth and young adults of color who experience economic and legal barriers to theater. And I'm also the executive producer of this podcast. Sophie Peyton is your host. Sophie is a director, producer, and community organizer who works at the intersection of intergenerational theater, grassroots organizing, and anti-oppression work. Theater Equity Revolution, which houses this podcast, is a company that Sophie and I are in the process of creating to reposition theater as a revolutionary art form. We are constructing the company to have our values govern the business structure, model, operational structure, daily systems, and content in order to conceptualize and test equitable ways of working and creating theater. Our values, such as power analysis, identity consciousness, and interdisciplinary inquiry, are not mere platitudes on a website, but are actions that determine the structure and our strategic planning. In that way, our value of accountability, for example, is used to establish company-wide systems for accountability. And as another example, our value of counter-hegemonic discourse is used to disrupt any inadvertent white normalized language and behavior that often privileges comfort, promotes toxic kindness, and attempts to police justified outrage at unjust practices. And while Theater Equity Revolution, or Theater ER for short, is still under construction, another of its values is social responsibility. So last week I told Sophie that I felt we had a responsibility to move forward with the current events program of Theater ER in response to what is happening in the world, in this country, and how that is not only impacting the theater industry, but share ways in which the industry and theater practitioners can use our platforms and craft as a revolutionary art form to fight back. The current events podcast will be just that, a podcast where Sophie, who is a badass researcher who has her pulse on the theater industry, will be discussing current events and how they relate to the theater industry, as well as share resources and ways to participate as artist activists. We are going to be moving fast. In order to talk about current events, we will not be spending a lot of time polishing episodes or getting hung up on perfectionism, and certainly not white normalized notions of professionalism. But mistakes will be made. And when they are, we will practice transparency and accountability by acknowledging those mistakes and then taking action to correct those mistakes. So, in today's episode, Sophie will be discussing her research and her point of view on the Trump takeover of the Kennedy Center and ways to take action. If you like our content, please subscribe, follow, or leave us a comment. We can be found on Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok for now by searching for Theater Equity Revolution. And for more in-depth feedback, please feel free to send us an email at theaterequityrevolution@gmail.com. Okay, Sophie, please take it away.
Thank you, Anna Sophia, for that lovely intro. So, what happened? There's a lot going on with the Kennedy Center. It's in the news a lot. There's a lot sort of happening at the moment. I want to take a moment to not only break it down, but also kind of pick apart how this happened, why this happened, and what we're going to do and what it means for our industry moving forward. So, some of the past context here, you may or may not know, Trump has never really been a giant fan of the Kennedy Center. He did not attend any of the Kennedy Center honors in his first term. The president and first lady traditionally attend the ceremony. They traditionally host the honorees at the White House. The only other time before Trump that a president has been absent from the ceremony is due to like very serious pressing international travel or crisis events, such as like the Iranian hostage crisis and other very serious, enormous things. So it's very non-traditional, I will say, for the president to not attend. Part of this kind of started in 2017 when we were sort of leading up, in the summer, kind of leading up to the awards in the winter. And three of the honorees threatened to skip the event rather than shake hands or share space with Trump. So fair request. Trump, of course, was, his ego is a little bruised, like it usually is. And he decided to steer clear of the ceremony for the rest of his term. I think it's Important to note that there is a history to this. This is like a retaliation thing he's following up on from his first term. He also, I think, and we'll talk about this more later, the Kennedy Center is a big deal. Like in some ways, it is the national cultural center of our country. And the fact that he's never set foot in there and didn't set foot in there when he was president, it means something, even symbolically. So here we are in term two. What happened here, right? Retaliation. Here we go. Trump replaces the board members with his own supporters. So people like the VP's wife, Mitch McConnell's wife, various other supporters of his. The new board, now with his supporters, elect him as the chairman of the board. Now he has even more power on the institution, running as the chairman of the board. Then, with that new power, he fires the president of the Kennedy Center, Deborah Rutter. She had planned on retiring, moving on at the end of the year anyway, but this was a pretty intentional and public move to say we would like to change this general value set that Deborah Rutter has upheld at the Kennedy Center over her tenure there for the past 8 or 9 years or so. Some of this is not super weird. Some of it is super weird. So the Kennedy Center does have a bipartisan board. That's not weird. There are Democrats and Republicans elected by the president, and they're there for a 6-year term. My assumption with the 6-year term is that it's probably supposed to like be more than one president's 4-year term, so that there is some sort of bipartisan balance on the board. Obviously, Trump has decided, whatever, that doesn't matter. It doesn't really, whatever. He has moved forward with the bipartisan element not being part of this anymore and has decided to fire board members and replace board members with people that he wants, regardless of what the term is, regardless of how long they were there. What is weird and frustrating and a little bit brain-breaking is that the organizational bylaws of the Kennedy Center are silent on whether or not the president can remove board members. This is something that Deborah Rutter said in an NPR interview, like just this past week or so. So the bylaws don't say whether the president can remove board members. So he just changed the board, and then everyone acted per his wishes, elected him, and then they fired the president. So how are these decisions made? This is not some sort of magical, unknown situation. Organizations are made up of humans. Humans function and build part of these systems. Decisions are made in part of these systems. So there are systems here. Nonprofits have boards. That is required. If they have 501c3 status, they're required to file with the IRS. When they incorporate, they're required to have a set of bylaws that determines the governing practices of the board and the organization and how things are going to function. And the bylaws, there are some rules and standards and legality to the bylaws for sure. There is also a lot of flexibility in there, which is the point, is that it should be manipulated and changed and refined to the organization that it's serving and how they want to govern. So do you see the problem here? The board determines the rules that the board has, and then the board holds themselves accountable to the rules they made for themselves. It to me feels a little reminiscent of some of the challenges and scariness we're seeing with the executive branch right now, right? We have a government structure rooted in our Constitution that involves 3 different parts, 3 different entities of power. And right now, we're seeing one of those entities of power, Congress and the legislative branch, give their power away to the executive branch. But if the executive branch is the one who determines and runs the laws and determines where money goes and is the person who's also holding them accountable, we don't have a system of equitable power balance here, and we don't have a way to be able to hold people accountable when they're abusing power and abusing people. So I hate to say it, but boards are kind of similar, and they've been kind of like this for a very, very long time. So who sets the rules for the board? The board sets the rules for the board. Who holds the board accountable? Well, the board holds the board accountable. These are the problems we face a lot in nonprofit regional theater, right? If the board makes a problem, if the organization has a problem, the only person we have to go to is the board. But the board is the people holding themselves accountable. So when you have a problem with the board, who do you go to? We don't have a judicial branch in regional theater. So we don't know. So these decisions do have a process. even if it's a messy process, even if it's a problematic process, there is a process here. So how did this happen? It's not as confusing or unclear as you may think it is. It kind of feels like a conspiracy. It kind of feels like pure chaos with the way the news is going and everything else. But there are like people and a process behind things like this happening, right? We are not in a moment where we know the ending of the story yet, right? We are living that out together right now. And so there is no ending to what this is. There is no impact of the Kennedy Center now becoming this crazy right-wing propaganda machine, right? This hasn't happened yet. There are individual people behind these processes, and there are things that we can do around decisions like this. So, like, I hate to be that person, but I am so not surprised by this news. I It's been pretty clear that the Republican Party and Christian nationalists are targeting education pretty hard and have been for the past several years. And it just makes sense that art would be next. I feel like a lot of the smart people that I follow and listen to have drawn a lot of parallels to past moments of resistance and past moments of authoritarian regimes where once they come for education, they're coming for the arts. So it's not unexpected, but it sucks. It really sucks. And it does have a lot of very scary implications if we just sit back and let it happen. And for what it's worth, like I will hop on the soapbox. When people say that the arts are non-essential or undervalued, don't forget that the president took over a fucking regional theater in the first month of his presidency, and he was that threatened by that cultural center. So when you want to say that the arts or live storytelling or theater or aren't sort of some very important essential part of not only our culture, but as tools for the revolution, don't even pretend because this is clearly an important platform. That's why the administration's targeting it. So I will also just put a pin in that. Clearly, our work matters and we're doing something right. I will say the Kennedy Center it's huge, right? I don't think we can pretend like it is not an enormous impact on our regional theater community and our national theater community. I mean, I remember the first time going to the Kennedy Center. Do you remember, Anna Sophia?
Yeah, I do. It was yeah, it was pretty wonderful. I'd say it almost felt spiritual. I felt like so part of a history and such a larger community. It was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I think I've only been once, but I do remember it. Like I remember the building, I remember the walls, I remember the feeling. And like for two theater nerds, trust me, I love being in a theater. I don't care what theater it is. I love school theaters, I love auditoriums, I love them all. But there is something different about walking into this National Cultural Center. It does feel different. There is a weight to it. Um, One of the quotes that I feel like really represents this, I was doing a little bit of digging of artists and people who are sort of talking about the Kennedy Center right now. And one of the quotes I found was from W. Kamau Bell, who is a comedian and an artist, a journalist, a writer, all the things. And he said this about his first time performing at the Kennedy Center. You can't help but feel how cool it is to be there, even as an audience member. You sort of feel like a bona fide winner at the Kennedy Center. There's something about performing there. Nobody's going to tell me I'm not an artist of note ever again, you know? And I just feel like that's so true. And it's like crazy to think that someone of his caliber feels like that as well. Like the Kennedy Center has weight. It has weight no matter where you are in your career as an artist. So, and as I started digging into this, I didn't even know this before, but the Kennedy Center literally has a congressional mandate from 1958 to be considered the National Performing Arts Center and the National Advocate for Arts Education. A congressional mandate. Like on paper, the Kennedy Center is supposed to represent us nationally in some way. Like that's a thing. So what happens here, what happens to this institution, it does matter. And the impact matters. And it's going to affect how we look at theater. It's going to affect how we think about art and the revolution. It's going to affect our nonprofit models moving forward. So we got to look at it. And look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like the Kennedy Center is some sort of radical arts institution or they're pushing for equity and labor in the arts and rights for artists in some sort of big forward-thinking way for the industry. I think their programming is really performative. I think that their now fired president, Deborah Rutter, has some really oppressive and exploitative labor practices, not only during the pandemic, but during her tenure. Even just in 2019, she was making $1.3 million a year. And in the pandemic, when all of the artists were out of work and on unemployment and not know where our career was going or if we had anything to come back to, she took a gracious pay cut of $500,000 so she could make $500,000 a year, more than the actual US president. So I do feel like this institution checks the box, right? They checked the box in 2022. They have a bunch of statements that we can link to if you want to see all of their false promises, like many other regional theaters, of the things they said they were going to do 5 years ago. So trust me, like I don't love the Kennedy Center. I'm not a giant fan, okay? But this affects all of us, and this affects our whole industry right now. So when our industry is being threatened, we have to push for solidarity. I will not let the government come for the arts, even the performative liberal ones, because we will come for you. And track record wise, in case you're curious, like the arts do always win out. So like if you were feeling sad, they do always win. The arc of justice is long. So what does this mean? We know how nonprofits work. We know that they have bylaws. We know they have a governance structure. Okay. Other things we know about the Kennedy Center. They have 36 board members that are appointed by the president. Serve that 6-year term. We also know the bylaws are silent on whether or not the president can remove board members, like Trump literally did 2 weeks ago. So we know the Kennedy Center bylaws are very clear that the board can elect their chairman. So how did this happen? Why did this happen? It's compliance, right? Who had to stay silent to let this happen? It's not in the bylaws that this is allowed. So who supported this? Who voted in favor of enabling Trump to do this? Didn't happen by accident, and the board didn't hold the board accountable. Surprise, surprise. What does this say about decision-making power at nonprofits? It's hard not to think about that a little bit, right? Are boards really the best option? The Kennedy Center board fucked up. Where is the board accountability? If there's something to focus on in the chaos of this story, I believe that the real nugget we need to take away is not how sad we are that the musical about the sharks isn't going to go on tour. I am also sad about that.
Could you tell me a little bit more, tell us a little bit more about what that is?
Oh yeah, sure. Um, yeah, yes, I can certainly tell you more about the fish. There are a lot of actions that are starting already around programming. And a lot of the implications of this are coming into play in that regard. So the story that the Kennedy Center told us is that they didn't have enough resources for this new musical called Finn. I looked it up a little bit. I haven't seen it, but I've heard great things. It's supposed to be a cute little children's musical. It's got a big queer analogy in the center of it about a shark who like fits in more with fishies than sharks or something like that, and finding himself as a sharky and all those things. But they canceled it. They canceled the show. Once Trump was elected boardman, they decided they didn't have the money for it and wanted to pull it. So I do feel like that is a good example of how do we see these partisan efforts playing out into programming in the immediate.
Thank you.
But mostly, I think we need to take away the fact that boards are not working. They are not a foolproof method for equitable and ethical nonprofit institutions. Boards do not have a clear accountability process at almost, if not all, nonprofit institutions. So this is when I start to spin out as an artist working in a field that primarily functions under the nonprofit model. I will say I was lucky enough recently to talk to a nonprofit lawyer and be able to ask some of these questions, or at least dig a little bit deeper into some of these questions. And some of the things they told me really blew my mind. I didn't realize that bylaws can be written pretty much however the board wants. Like I said, there are legal requirements in there, but other than that, they can give their decision-making power away to anyone in the bylaws. They can literally say, the board will not vote on this. We elect this person to vote on this. They can say, we're not going to be the people who hire this position. We're actually moving forward with this committee that's going to be hiring this. They can literally write out their power in their bylaws. So they can have more accountability. They don't have to be the final decision maker. They don't have to be the final say on board actions, but they are. We've created and reinforced this in the nonprofit sector. It's not inherent to nonprofits or inherent to bylaws. We've reinforced it. So why did this happen? Compliance. Well, this is a classic case of, well, this is how it's always been done. There's no change, there's no questioning, there's no revisions. And I can find no real reason to even do this other than capitalistic power hoarding at the top of institutions.
Is your point that nonprofit could be less harmful, or is it that should we even stick with nonprofits? Like what is your takeaway from that?
I think my takeaway is that even though you can run a nonprofit better, it doesn't matter when it comes down to unethical practices happening. Like it's literally not in the bylaws what Trump did. So the bylaws wouldn't have saved them if they were like, oh, these people make music. Like, what they just didn't even do. It wasn't even in the bylaws. No one held them accountable. So I feel like my takeaway is boards are the problem. Boards don't work.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I continuously hear about how to like make boards better, more equitable and all, like is it's who you get on the board, right? Because that's another thing is like boards are often people who are not connected to the art. They're
Right.
often fundraisers, people who don't understand like even what theater really is. So but to me, that's like, well, we're just solving the problem of the individual. The structure is still the issue. So when I hear you say that, well, we can change who's making the decision-making power, does that actually change
Mm,
the structure, is my question?
I think I'm not sure. I think in some ways I want to trust that if we rewrite the bylaws and we put in more equitable values into our governance structures, that that will yield a more accountable board structure moving forward. And also, these group of people, whether it was in the bylaws or not, the Kennedy Center did this anyway. So maybe it doesn't matter if it's written in the bylaws, and maybe the board is just the problem. I honestly don't really know.
I'd also like to add, this is something that you and I are really like trying to figure out as we put together this company, uh, Theater ER. Like we've gone back and forth on whether or not to be a nonprofit for these very reasons. And I think, I've kind of been the more resistant one out of the two of us to do a nonprofit structure. But the big incentive, right, is are the tax cuts, right?
Yeah, and I mean, we've talked at length about the racist roots of nonprofits and the fact that they were primarily the 501(c)(3) status came about when income tax came about. And so a lot of rich people just wanting to hoard their money and stick it into a nonprofit for the tax benefits, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons, historically and otherwise, to not want to lean into this business model as like an ethical and equitable way of working moving forward. I think this is a huge point of contention with artists right now. I think there is a lot of distrust of boards from artists. And I think a lot of institutions and artistic admins also have contentious relationships with their boards. And a lot of these issues, instead of being discussed or brought into the light and really interrogated, I feel like are often being coded and labeled as these like, well, this is how it's been done. This is what we have to do. This is our system, right? There's a lie there's a lie I hear all the time at nonprofits. We can't be political, right? Have you ever heard that lie, Anna Sophia? Right? A million times.
Oh, please.
Yeah, exactly. They can't be political. What a huge lie that is. Okay. It's such a lie. And it's also just a huge way to silence artists and nonprofit direct action. The thing that I learned when I started to pick this apart, specifically kind of leading up to the election, was like, there has to be something we can do, right? There has to be something nonprofits can do. We can't be political is like nonsense. So I started digging into it a little bit. And what I learned is that nonprofits cannot be partisan. So they cannot align themselves with a specific political party. And the meaning they can't support a party or a candidate, right? They can't be partisan in that sense specifically. So, like, they can't give money to a state legislator who's a Democrat and say, please put more money into the arts for us. Can you lobby for that this year, right? Obviously, I think for good reason, that's illegal. What I will say, though, that's not the only way to be political. And if you think lobbying is the extent of being political, then you are masking the point. That's also not a sentence. Arts are political as fuck. Arts are critical to political resistance, and they always have been. And especially now, with this administration beginning to target us and target the theater industry, it's more important than ever to really dive into the fact that arts are political as fuck. Arts have to be part of the political resistance now more than ever. So here's the messy section where I don't really have super clean cut historical researched examples of like what to do and figure out what's going on. It's just scary and uncertain and emotional, and it's a lot. Um, And while I know a lot of these things in some variation have happened before, right? There are many other authoritarian regimes in the history of our world across various countries. There are things to look to. But right now, we're really kind of in this new tier of authoritarianism that's like deeply entrenched in late stage capitalism. And all of this is happening in the social media era where we're communicating and relating and building relationships in very different ways than we ever have before. So there is no roadmap here. And I'm not gonna lie, like it's unnerving. I'm a pretty anxious person, and not having a roadmap feels no good. So I have to sort of cultivate a practice for myself of like, if I can't see where we're going, how do I at least find some things to ground along the way? I will say, it's actually a quote from this poster, that it's about perfectionism. That if you don't know the next step, like you don't know the next stone to take, become fascinated with the shape of the stone. So I find myself in this moment being fascinated with the shape of the stone. I don't quite know what stone I'm going to need next, but I can at least spend a lot of energy on the stone that I'm at now. And in sort of prepping for this podcast, I tried to sort of find what some of those stones were for me. And what are the things that sort of help me roadmap lists continue to still make steps forward? I'm curious, Anna Sophia, if you've found any of those things as well.
Well, I love the the stone analogy. Well, I think one thing that I'm doing very differently that I've never done in my life before is really prioritizing joy. And I'm, which is, it's there's that quote, joy can be an act of resistance. Like they're not going to stop me from like
Mhm.
living my life. So yeah, I'm lifting heavy weights and I'm dancing, I'm doing the tango and I'm cha-chaing as the world is burning. But that's not all. Like I'm not just staying in that. I'm not just closing it all off. Sometimes I need that in order to like be okay. But I'm also aligning myself with social justice organizations and protesting. So those are some of the things I'm holding on to.
Thank you for that. I think it's important to just share how we're figuring out navigating any of this. So, even just hearing a little bit from you, I think is really helpful. You mentioned protests. I will use that to also acknowledge that, like, people have been protesting the Kennedy Center. Many of them have been super visibly queer, which is really great to see. A lot of artists are pulling out. There's been a lot of headlines around Issa Rae pulling her show, Shonda Rhimes pulling out of the board, or pulling off staff. I can't remember exactly. I think she was on the board. I'm not sure. Ben Folds pulling out. Various other big artists kind of saying, we don't want to support the Kennedy Center. We're out. We also talked a little bit about the musical Finn that was pulled due to financial restraints, aka they didn't like that it was about some analogy for queer people. And AEA has sort of stood up to say, AEA meaning the Actors Equity Association, the union that supports actors and stage managers in our field. They've said that they're going to stand up and they're going to try and enforce these contracts. They're going to try and watch the company and the production and share developments as carefully as they can. So, what is the artist's role in combating this moving forward? Because I swear to fucking God, if we let regional theaters, like local regional theaters, like look to the Kennedy Center as an example to just do more harm and roll back any of the progress towards equitable ways of working, I will be so fucking pissed. So, we're not going to let that happen, right? We've already heard calls from other people and artists saying, cancel your subscriptions to the Kennedy Center, like stop supporting them. But that's not a good way to support the artists. And that's not going to be a good way to stand up to this regime. So, not attending, not spending money on art, that's not really the answer either. And some people are pulling out. Is that the answer? I don't know. I do feel like it's complicated and it's so messy. And I think being able to hold that complexity is really important. For me personally, like I fully support Issa Rae canceling her show. Do I wish that a bunch of Issa Rae fans were going to show up to hear her content on that stage at this time? Yeah, I do. But I also respect that that's not the right decision for her, and that's why she made that choice. I mentioned W. Kamau Bell earlier, right? He's not canceling his show. He said in an interview, on some level, it's like I, the performer, want to do the thing I've been looking forward to. Then there's this part of me that knows my audience, specifically in times of stress and pain and controversy, actually want to hear from me, like me. And some of it is about showing up and being my full self, as my mom taught me. So artists, I think there's a lesson in this. Don't shrink. Whether that's pulling your show and having that power, whether that's staying there and getting louder. Don't believe this administration. Don't give them power they don't have. Commit to noncompliance and resist at every level. So where do we go from here? What is the call to action? I feel strongly that we need to move towards collective responsibility, not individualistic solutions, right? This is not a problem that's going to be solved by like better board members at the Kennedy Center. So what are the next steps? Like systemically, what do we take away and what do we do with this info now? My best advice, the thing I will encourage you to do is to take this local. You're an artist and you're a worker. So do not let your bosses and decision makers give in. Do not let them cave early to this administration's pressures, and do not let them stay silent and be compliant.
How? How do we not let them? Like, what are some steps there? Because I totally agree with you, but what does that look like?
What a good question. It looks like a lot of things. It looks like a lot of things, right? Resistance looks like a lot of things. In the ways that we're seeing artists push back, there is public pressure we can apply, and there's personal pressure we can apply. And we have agency and leverage in both areas. We also have power not only outside of our institutions, but inside of our institutions. So some of the things that I would encourage you to do, when I say don't let bosses and decision makers give in, I say challenge them at meetings. Go to your board meetings. Ask for your bylaws. See what's in there. See if you need more protections that you need to add. Make sure that you're not quiet at your staff meetings. If someone says something or wants to start to use different language and move away from using the word diversity, you better question that.
Something that is so Midwest is the call in versus the call out. And what I'm hearing
Yeah.
is there's no more, we can't do that anymore. We can't assume that calling in and keeping it individualistic is going to account to anything. And it's also not helping the other people that are probably being harmed in the room as well. So thank you for going there with me on some of those examples.
You're so welcome. I think the thing that I sit with when it comes to like what to do, not like what not to do, is, it comes from the Abolitionist Handbook by Patrisse Cullors that we really need to push for imagination. And I think that's something that artists do better than anyone else. So if you're not sure what that resistance looks like, maybe lean into your artistic skills. What do you imagine it looks like? What do you imagine a meeting looks like where you don't feel so uncomfortable and tense and unseen at your workplace? Maybe imagine what it looks like if your artistic admin folks get together and like go petition the board to make a change, right? We have the power to envision what this is going to be and what's going to happen next. Like I said, the story is not over yet. The other thing I will say is watch the Kennedy Center. Let's keep an eye on it because I think it's going to teach us something about politicizing our nonprofit institutions. We know that this is no longer a bipartisan board. This is a partisan and political institution, and that's against how nonprofits traditionally function. So inevitably, it's going to start some new norms about how boards and programming function at our artistic institutions. And I think it's important we watch that. I will also say, and I know this, I don't know, maybe controversial, but if they want to break our current structures, like this administration is clearly trying to do at rapid pace, I think we should embrace the space that they make for us. I think that we can take that space for critical analysis, and I think we can take it and build something new. Because if there's one thing that artists are good at, it's imagining and it's creating. So let us use those strengths for the movement. The opposition cannot dream as big as we can and as much as we have been. And if we're dreaming bigger and we're dreaming farther, I will say we have to start building systems of sustainability outside of our government. I will keep yelling this one from the rooftops: mutual aid, mutual aid, mutual aid. We have enough for each other and we can support each other. And we can't keep trusting and waiting for people in power to like get it right or learn their lessons. I will leave you with this quote from Jade Simmons, a musician, artist, speaker, amazing human. You can't do your next level vision at your current size. You need to be bigger to accomplish the next big thing. I love Jade Simmons so much. I always think about that. When I feel small and scared, I remember that I can't do what I want to do at my current size. Like I have to get bigger. So let's get bigger. Artists, let's root deeper and let's be louder, even when they want us to be small.
I love that. Thank you. And I just want to say here too, which might make you a little uncomfortable, Sophie, as far as like getting bigger, this was terrifying for you, right?
Yeah. Why are you bringing this up?
Because I think like what I've been hearing like at protests, there was literally like a protest that I went to the other day that was like the chant was "We are not afraid," and I'm like, fuck yeah, we're afraid. Like let's be honest about that. We're afraid. And we need to speak up anyways. We need to fight back anyways. And putting your face out there, you're a producer, you're a director, you're not an actor, you're not a performer. Neither one of us like being the center of attention. And we battle imposter syndrome. You've shared about that. I hope that's okay to say. Thank you. And I know this was really hard for you to do and come out, but I think it is so important because anytime you have a platform and any way you can use your craft to get bigger and have your voice heard is important. And I appreciate you being a model for that.
I think it's fair to note, yeah, even though it makes me very uncomfortable, this project in and of itself is an example of that for me, trying to pursue my next level vision and needing to get bigger to do that. I will say that I think the most important thing about it for me is how much discomfort I feel with it. And I find myself right now pursuing as much discomfort as I can. We are in a world in a society right now that I think overprivileges comfort, not just in regards to like white supremacy standards, but also comfort in general. And, even just the small example of like sometimes we used to meet up with people and like not know when they were going to get there. And that was like uncomfortable to like sit there alone and not know when they were coming. Like there's just small moments of discomfort in daily life that we've taken away. And what we're doing right now with no roadmap, with no idea what to do, it's uncomfortable. So I don't know. I will also say thank you for pushing me towards the discomfort. And I think it's a good example, even if it makes me really uncomfortable to share.
All right, awesome. Would you share a little bit about like your sources or things that you read that prepped you for this podcast?
Thank you for framing it like that. I really appreciate that because this is certainly not some kind of like research paper bibliography. This is really just an informal collection of things that I consumed and content I read and things that affected my thinking around this as I was preparing for this podcast episode. So it runs a pretty wide gamut. There's everything from artist accounts, accounts of protests or artists who have canceled or are not canceling, such as W. Kamau Bell. There's interviews with the former president. There's some information about Kennedy Center history and funding history. There's also, I just wanted to link some of the DEI coverage that the Kennedy Center put out in 2020. If you're interested in sort of what they said or what they said they were going to do, those are in there as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sophie. And yeah, thanks for all your research, your insights, and especially for your call to action to speak up and get bigger.
My pleasure. I come with direct action and next steps everywhere I go. So I'm sure there'll be more to come, even if it's just for you and me, Anna Sophia.
Yeah, I trust that. And thank you all for tuning in. At some point, we may add a Patreon or membership option for this content, but in the meantime, please subscribe or follow us on social media by looking up Theater Equity Revolution.
And please reach out to us. We want to hear from you. A lot of this is intended to be an ongoing conversation. We don't have all the answers. We're not some kind of experts here. We're really just trying to talk about these things more openly and transparently with our community. So we hope to hear from you soon.
And please stay tuned for more upcoming current events and ways to participate as artist activists in our shared social responsibility.